Richard Branson, Michael Phelps, Justin Timberlake, James Carville. Wait a minute. Where are the women? Greta Gerwig, Lisa Ling, Audra McDonald, Simone Biles. That sounds like a list of highly successful titans in a variety of industries. They all have ADHD, but you don't hear much about that now, do you? You know what else you don't hear about? Are the 43% of people with ADHD who are in excellent mental health. Why aren't we talking about them and what they're doing right? I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka, and that's exactly what we do here. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, a lifelong student, and now the author of my new book, ADHD for Smartass Women. I'm also a certified ADHD coach and the creator of Your ADHD Brain is A-OK, a patented system that helps ADHD women just like you get unstuck and fall in love with their brilliant brains. Here, we embrace our too muchness and we focus on our strengths. My guests and I credit our ADHD for some of our greatest gifts. And to those who still think they're too much, too impulsive, too scattered, too disorganized, I say, no one ever made a difference by being too little. Hello, I'm Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for a new episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. I hope you'll subscribe to this podcast and our newsletter over at ADHDforsmartwomen.com. My purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. And in the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something, not one, and that includes you, my friend. This week, I'll be discussing how to effectively prepare for a meeting with an ADHD clinician to seek a diagnosis. You know, I get this question all the time, and especially in our big 100,000 member Facebook group, ADHD for Smartass Women. And I've noticed that a lot of women are fearful and stressed out by the prospect of having to meet with their clinician to discuss their ADHD. What they're worried about is, well, they're afraid they're going to get a clinician who is not an expert in ADHD in women, and that clinician will have outdated information about ADHD, and who's going to tell them that they're wrong? They're also worried that this clinician is going to think that they're lying about the ADHD just to get medication. Now, I have to tell you that the main reason that I finally just got diagnosed, I knew I had it. My son had been diagnosed. It explained all the questions that I'd ever had about myself because I had heard so many women's stories about how ADHD medication had literally changed their life, and so I was hoping that I would be one of them. As you all know, sadly, I wasn't. I'm actually part of the 20 to 30% of those of us who the medication does nothing for except create worse symptoms. So I wasn't lying to get medication, but I definitely wanted to try it. I had done a lot of research primarily for my son, but also research about how ADHD presents in women, that I was certain that I had ADHD, and so I can completely relate to how you may feel. I, too, was nervous that what I knew to be true would be challenged, and I would be told, nope, you're wrong, it's not ADHD. So psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, family doctors, nurse practitioners, therapists, and or clinical social workers can all theoretically diagnose you with ADHD in the States. But just because they can doesn't mean that they will, even if you have the most obvious of symptoms. And once you're diagnosed, you will still need a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician's assistant under the supervision of a physician to prescribe ADHD medication. To add to the confusion, laws for how prescriptions for ADHD are handled vary by state, since the medications fall into the category of stimulants. There's also no standard diagnoses for adults with ADHD. Now, there is a task force commissioned by the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders called APSARD that is developing adult ADHD guidelines. The last I heard, they will be out sometime, hopefully at the end of 2024. There's also no blood test, genetic test, or medical or physical test that you can take to diagnose ADHD. Instead, what happens is a practitioner is going to gather your personal and medical history using a lot of different sources, including symptom checklists. These are where you are rating your own symptoms, or behavior rating scales, which are typically filled out by people you know, and they know you well, parents, partners, teachers. And this is what allows clinicians to understand your behavior across many domains, such as in the home, at school, at work. The idea is that we may not be able to recognize our own symptoms, which is why they have others rate our traits. Now, you can imagine that if you have a partner or parents who see ADHD as an excuse, they don't understand it, they don't want to think they've done anything wrong, they may dismiss your symptoms, which is an entirely another problem. In my case, I initially met with a psychologist who used a symptoms checklist and asked me a bunch of questions about my childhood, what I felt were my challenges, if the symptoms had gotten worse. She then gave me behavior rating scales to measure my ADHD symptoms. So I had to fill out a behavior rating scale, and then she also had my husband fill out the same rating scale. I then came back a week later, and she scored the forms and gave me the ADHD diagnosis and then asked if I was interested in medication. I said yes. She gave me a referral, and I made an appointment for a week later with the psychiatrist. When I met with the psychiatrist, he must have spent at most 15 minutes with me. We didn't talk about anything that I remember. There was no discussion about the different kinds of medication, stimulant or non-stimulant. There was no discussion about non-pharmacological options that I could do with the medication or instead of the medication. He just handed me a script for Adderall. I should mention that I'm also in California, and so I'm part of Kaiser, which I think is the nation's largest HMO. The process may be very different depending on where you are in the country and your health coverage. I know that Kaiser had recently been sued, and I believe they settled for millions for mishandling of patients in their psychiatry department. So it was pretty easy to get diagnosed as compared to many of the stories that I hear from other women. I also suspect that the fact that my son had had extensive testing done helped, because we know that ADHD is about as heritable as height. Since then, I've been re-diagnosed by Lori Peterson's company, eDiagnostic Learning. I've had her on the podcast, I think 3 times now. 2 times we talked about all different kinds of testing, including ADHD testing. The 3rd time, sadly, she was one of 4 women who shared their story of grief after losing a parent. Lori's testing, I thought, was much more thorough than the testing that I got at Kaiser. eDiagnostic Learning now has a program specifically designed to test women for ADHD. Now remember, I'm in California. eDiagnostic Learning is in Texas. So if you were interested in medication, you take her company's results to your psychiatrist or medical doctor, and then they would be able to diagnose medication. And I have not heard of a problem doing it this way. But again, this is a privilege, right? Why would I get diagnosed twice? Let me tell you why. So my son Marcus was diagnosed 3 times with ADHD, and it wasn't until the 3rd time that he was finally diagnosed with dyslexia, which he will tell you is the diagnosis that he identifies most with. I noticed that all of his testing seemed much more thorough than mine. He had similar symptoms checklists and, rating behavior scales, those forms, which we filled out as his parents. And then I think the principal of his elementary school filled them out, and his primary teacher. His first testing was at age 12, and it lasted the better part of a day. I think it was 6 hours. They gave him the Wechsler Intelligence Scale test, or they called it the WISC-4. This test is given to assess cognitive function and ability. They're looking for giftedness and learning disabilities and strengths and weaknesses in kids' cognitive abilities. Now, cognitive skills or function means the ability to perform various mental activities that you would associate with learning and problem solving. Things like sustained attention, speed that you are able to process information, working memory, etc. Then, when he was 16, right before he started his junior year of high school, we had him retested, which we needed to do for college. The doctor met with him 1 or 2 times a month for the summer before he retook the test, and he was diagnosed that time by a psychologist as well. Now, this particular psychologist really got to know him literally the whole summer, but frankly, that psychologist still missed the dyslexia. But this time, the psychoeducational evaluation included the Woodcock-Johnson 3 battery of tests. I personally thought these tests were far superior to the WIS tests. I just felt like they were so much more comprehensive, and they really helped us and him to pinpoint what his strengths and relative weaknesses were. Now, if you talk to Lori Peterson at eDiagnostic Learning, she will tell you that she prefers the WIS test. I joke that, however, that this Woodcock-Johnson test is the one that really turned me into a tiger mom when it came to fighting for my son with his teachers. Marcus is one of those kids that can calculate numbers really fast in his head. He's just always been really good at math, yet that's the subject that he's hated the most, and it just never made sense to me. Well, when he took the Woodcock-Johnson test, he was generally in the 98th percentile in math. At that point, I guessed that what was really going on is he was bored because he didn't feel challenged. So Marcus's third testing occurred the summer between his freshman and sophomore years of college. Again, he was really struggling with math. And this was when we decided that we were going to get him tested again. And this time we really wanted them to look for visual processing skills and dyslexia. So that was the time that he was tested by eDiagnostic Learning in Texas, and he was finally diagnosed with dyslexia. What we learned is that dyslexia is on a spectrum like ADHD. So you can have very few symptoms of dyslexia and not struggle so much, or you can have a lot of symptoms. Because Marcus could read, no one ever considered dyslexia, even though we personally, as his parents, would see that he'd buy all the books. He wanted to be a reader, but he never read any of them. We've now discovered that there are 6 different types of dyslexia. And if you're interested in dyslexia, I have several podcasts on dyslexia that you can take a look at. You need to know, though, it is a common co-occurrence with ADHD. So ultimately, his problems with math began when he started to mix the numbers with the letters, right? So algebra, right? I believe that's when it started. So when I found out about Marcus's dyslexia diagnoses, I thought, well, maybe that's my struggle with reading. It takes me forever to read. And writing, I have trouble organizing my thoughts as well. One of the things we tend to do, those of us with ADHD, is we also question. Even though we've been diagnosed with ADHD, we're still thinking and questioning, but is it really true? Do I have ADHD? And especially when we're more traditionally successful, right? We question our ADHD. And again, I know this is privilege, but I decided that I wanted the full battery of testing like Marcus, so I got retested, this time by eDiagnostic Learning 2. I also want to mention that my daughter has used them as well, and she was diagnosed with ADHD after her first semester of law school. So she did really great in school, and then she got into law school, and she kept asking me, Mom, I know this stuff, but why is it that I am studying so hard and I always do worse than my friends, even when I really feel like I know the subject matter better than they do? So that's when I finally said to her, you know, Taya, I've noticed some symptoms of ADHD, frankly, for forever, but they're getting more pronounced, so I think you should get diagnosed. She got diagnosed, she got on medication, doesn't use it all the time, just when she really needs to study, and her grades went up by at least a half a grade in every subject, but in some subjects, a full grade. So it really made a difference. Now, during the process, I took the adult version of the cognitive test that Marcus had taken, and it's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS, W-A-I-S. And this is designed to measure intelligence and cognitive ability. So you get an IQ test. I don't know if I ever had an IQ test, but I got one, and I was terrified to do it, but I was pleasantly surprised. So this is what happened. I also filled out a symptom checklist and a more detailed background form, and I completed something called the QB test. What I really liked about the QB test and, of course, the TOVA test is these are objective tests. So they measure your performance against people without ADHD, and also they use data from individuals diagnosed with ADHD. So you compare how pronounced is your ADHD relative to other people who take the test. And for hyperactivity, I was shocked to discover that I was in the 99th percentile. After this battery of tests, I was re-diagnosed with ADHD, but not dyslexia. My slow reading and difficulty with writing was related to my ADHD. I hear often from ADHD women that getting an ADHD diagnosis is therapeutic. I would second that. Even though you know you have ADHD, there's a feeling of reassurance when you know why you've been struggling, like it's confirmed. And in my own experience, retesting with the WAIS test, that IQ testing, it really boosted my self-esteem because it showed I was actually really good at critical thinking. I had strong visual spatial skills, which I was always panning and making fun of. And I learned that these strong visual spatial skills were actually useful in advanced math like trigonometry. And this explained to me, how was I able to do so well in trigonometry in high school? I got the highest grade in the class while having to work so hard to get B's in other math classes. And I remember really disliking like geometry and algebra, calculus, but I really loved trigonometry. Well, now I know. I had very strong visual spatial skills. And I always felt with trigonometry that there was a formula and there was a lot of structure. There was a system to it, and I understood it. The WAIS test also showed that I actually had strong working memory, even though I had told myself for decades that I didn't. And you probably heard me on this podcast. I always talk about my poor working memory. Well, I still think it's not great, but it's not as bad as I thought it would be. So these psychoeducational evaluations, I'm going to be straight with you, they can be expensive. I would say anywhere from $750 to, I know when my son was young, we checked with a psychologist who did this kind of psychoeducational testing. Granted, it was in probably the most wealthy counties in the country, but she wanted $7,000, and that was 10 years ago. So I have no idea what it would be now. So it depends on where you live. It depends on how many specialists are available in your area. So in that regard, I think eDiagnostic Learning, which is on the lower end of that range, is actually very fairly priced. Now, my health insurance paid for my original diagnostic testing, but it didn't cover the second round that I did. But I felt both tests were well worth the price because, again, they provided more insight into how my brain works. You don't need these standardized tests, but if you can afford them, I'd recommend it. In my book, Lori Peterson helped me with the getting diagnosed part, and she specifically said that whichever way you decide to get tested for ADHD, it should be more comprehensive than, we've heard about these 15-minute appointments and one single test, the checklist, right? Client interviews and behavior rating scales, they're important, but the assessment should also include an objective measure of where your skills are in comparison to peers of your same age that don't rely on the opinions or observations of others. She also recommends seeking out providers or practices that use standardized testing like WAIS that can assess your executive function skills, as well as an additional objective measure like that QB test. Finally, if you're confident that you have ADHD but you're told otherwise, get a second opinion by a clinician who understands ADHD in women. Those of us with ADHD, we often have strong intuition, so we need to learn how to trust it. Okay, so this is what testing and obtaining an ADHD diagnosis looked like for me and my son personally, and I promise you that I will talk about some low-cost help and support, so stick with me if that's what you're needing. So let's back up a little and say, okay, you want to get tested. Where should you start? Obviously, if money is no object, if you're living in an area where doctors don't believe in ADHD because they're not trained, I would do my research and I would find a clinician who specializes in ADHD in your area, and I would pay out of pocket. I will say this isn't easy. Psychiatry, sadly, is the least respected field in medicine. Many people don't even regard psychiatrists as real medical doctors. And this isn't just among the public. This is also among health professionals, which means that fewer and fewer doctors are choosing this specialty, which is horrible. I know that child psychologists, it's even worse. They're like dinosaurs. They are becoming rarer and rarer because so few doctors are choosing that specialty. I initially went to Kaiser, my HMO, to get diagnosed. But when I discovered that the psychiatrist who prescribed my Adderall, which caused anxiety for me, really knew little to nothing about ADHD beyond Adderall and Ritalin, I found a psychiatrist who had been the head of women's health in Northern California for Kaiser. She was expensive, and every time I had to write that check, I just could feel the lump in my throat. But you know how we can get with ADHD. We are going to get to the bottom of it. We are going to figure it out. She cost me $600 an hour. And it wasn't long before I realized that, no dissing on her, I think she was really, really qualified, but I was basically a science experiment, right? A science experiment that I was funding. Again, she was really knowledgeable about ADHD, but the thing is, there are no magic pills, if meds don't work for you. It's not like you give one pill and it works for everybody. So if meds create more symptoms than benefits, there's no choice but to keep trying and just seeing, okay, is this one going to work? Remember, all brains are different. All brains are unique. So what works for one patient does not necessarily work for another patient. All that said, I would start if I were in a position where I was just considering perhaps I have ADHD, where do I go? I would start by asking for a recommendation from anyone that you know who has a familiarity with ADHD. Either they've been diagnosed, their child's been diagnosed, their grandchild's been diagnosed. You need a clinician who really knows ADHD. And so I'm assuming you're only going to take a recommendation from someone you know who is raving about their clinician. And I don't know if I mentioned this before. If I didn't, I should have said it earlier. The psychologist is typically the one who will diagnose ADHD. Granted, there's all different kinds of other clinicians who can diagnose as well, but usually it's a psychologist. And then the psychiatrist is the one that will usually write the prescription for medication. Although all medical doctors, if you have an MD, you can write the prescription for ADHD medication. I would also ask your primary care physician if they have any recommendations, if you don't know anyone personally who has worked with an ADHD clinician. Most ADHD diagnoses for kids, they come from pediatricians. And that's fine if they're trained in ADHD, but most of them aren't. So if I'm going to consider giving my child stimulant medication, I want to know that an expert in ADHD has diagnosed him or her first, right? Not just their pediatrician, unless their pediatrician is an expert in ADHD. Now, I know I'm asking for a lot here, but I have this philosophy, which you probably already know, that if you haven't personally experienced what I'm going through, you're not expert enough for me. I am always looking for firsthand experience, especially with ADHD. This is really important to me. There is so much misinformation about ADHD, and there's something about people that have ADHD, they just get it. Our best purposes give meaning to our past, right? So they've lived it. So my recommendation is when looking for an ADHD specialist, a psychologist, psychiatrist, coach, therapist, social worker, if I can find someone who also has ADHD, that is always my preference. And the beauty of what's going on right now is that many clinicians are now very open about the fact they have ADHD versus before, I think it was much more hidden. So it's not that hard to find a clinician who also has been diagnosed with ADHD. We've interviewed a lot of them on my podcast. And if I'm really reaching for the sky, of course, I would want a female clinician who has ADHD. Why female? Same reason. ADHD presents differently in women, and this is only now being studied. For decades, ADHD in girls and women was just missed because it didn't look like the stereotypical 7-year-old ADHD boy who was being annoying and bouncing off the walls. I should say it often did not. Sometimes it did. I also believe that there's something akin to midlife ADHD. Women who've had symptoms of ADHD since childhood, but they haven't reached the level of interference to classify as ADHD until midlife, when their hormones start bouncing around. And what we know now is estrogen modulates dopamine. Rachel Germeroth, in our big 100,000 member Facebook group, has created an ADHD directory that she built using our Facebook group and others, and a Google form and sheet combination. It's a list of professionals who our members have had success with. Right now, it's a very small list of professionals, but they're professionals from all over the world. So if you live in a bigger city, I think it's worth a shot, and you can find it at spyhappy.me/ADHD profs list. So ADHD PROFS list. And of course, this will all be in the show notes. One of the questions you want to ask of any professional is, how many women with ADHD have you treated? How many children with ADHD have you treated if you're looking for someone for your child? This right there tells you an awful lot. And the answer cannot be a dozen or 24. It should be hundreds. Where else can you start? Well, professional directories are fantastic. You can go to ADA, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association. Again, I'm going to have links to all of this in the show notes. CHAD, which is Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Attitude Magazine directory. You can find it at attitudemag.com. Terry Matlin's professional directory called getadhdhelp.com. And there, of course, is ADCA, which is the ADD Coach Academy. If you're looking for an ADHD coach, I think their program is outstanding. I am a graduate. I don't get anything for telling you this. Also, you could take a look at who's writing the books and blog posts, who's speaking at the ADHD conferences about ADHD, who's speaking on the webinars. They are all seeing patients and clients. So much of the information that we find today is online. So if you see an expert that you really relate to who's out of state, and you think, oh, it would be so nice to just work with them, you probably can, as long as you aren't taking stimulant medication. Stimulant medication is a Schedule II medication per the DEA, which has the highest levels of regulation for any prescribed medication. Most states don't allow physicians to prescribe Schedule II meds without in-person visits, so there's that. I do think this will change over time with more education, but for right now, that's just the way it is. Now, you can work with someone virtually. I keep mentioning eDiagnostic Learning because that's who I used. You can get diagnosed through them, and then you take your diagnoses, which is signed off, of course, by a psychologist, a doctor, and then you take that to your psychiatrist or your general doctor, and they will then, most of the time, prescribe ADHD medication from that. Now, the other thing I want to say is you need to go in prepared. Look, I did a lot of research, and I went into my appointment understanding what the symptoms of ADHD were generally, but also how they presented for women and how they presented specifically for me. If you are nervous going in, and then you meet with a psychologist or psychiatrist who doesn't understand your ADHD, I promise you, your short and long-term memory will fail and you won't remember anything. If you're anything like me, that's exactly what would happen. This won't happen if you go in prepared. If someone asks me, what are the symptoms of ADHD? Even though I'm immersed in this every day, sometimes I can still rattle around thinking, oh my gosh, what are the symptoms, right? However, if someone asks me, is blurting out a symptom of ADHD? I won't ever forget that. Of course it is. My point is make this easy for yourself. And guess what? I'm going to help you. I've created a checklist for you to go through before your appointment. You can check off your symptoms, how your ADHD presents. If there are symptoms that aren't listed and you think they might be ADHD symptoms, add them. Again, this is not a comprehensive checklist. It's a place to help you organize your thoughts because I know your brain. If you have a structure, I know you can do this. So I am giving you this structure. And by the way, this checklist is for adults only. So what I've done to develop this checklist is I've gone through the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I've also looked at Russell Barkley's adult scale, and I've created a checklist with the criteria for ADHD in adults. So you need 5 or more symptoms of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity. They must be present. These symptoms must be present for at least 6 months. These symptoms must be present before the age of 12. There are many ADHD experts who believe that symptoms in girls often don't appear until puberty, which can be much later than 12. It can be 16 or even later, right? For me personally, I was 13 before the big symptoms showed up. These symptoms must be present in at least 2 or more settings: home, school, work, friends, relatives, other activities. There is no requirement, however, that the symptoms at this age cause impairment. They just have to be present at this age. Finally, for an ADHD diagnosis, you have to have clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. Let me use myself as an example here. Look, I had many symptoms of ADHD that were present before the age of 12. I was totally hyperactive, very chatty. Remember, my parents called me the Burlingame Blab. Could not tell me any family secrets because I would tell anybody that would listen. I was impulsive. I was this bundle of energy. However, they didn't become impairing until my mid-40s, right? I mean, you know, I was chatty, I was very chatty, but I was also charming. So I kind of got away with it in most cases, right? Or I didn't even realize the impairment. Like I didn't realize people might have been rolling their eyes at me because I would just go on, right? So in my mid-40s, the symptoms interfered with or reduced the quality of social, academic, or occupational function. Thus, they qualified for the ADHD diagnosis. There's also a good chance that if you're a woman and you go in wanting to talk about ADHD, your clinician doctor may suggest that it's anxiety or depression. And it might be. But remember, ADHD is a comorbid or co-occurring condition. That means that it can still exist with anxiety and depression. For most clinicians that I've spoken with, however, the recommendation is, in most cases, to treat the ADHD first because the cause of the anxiety or depression could very well be the frustration of living with ADHD. And so if you resolve that or greatly reduce it, you greatly reduce the symptoms of anxiety and or depression and may eliminate them altogether. So I'm not a doctor, not a clinician, but I know how your brain works because I share it. So my goal is just to give you a framework or structure to recognize and discuss your symptoms with your doctor. I know once you have a structure, you will be able to do this. And you can download my checklist at ADHDforsmartwomen.com/ADHD-doctor, or you can go to our show notes and find it there. When you go in for your diagnosis, ask about alternatives to medication and follow-up care. Again, pills don't teach skills, right? Study after study indicates that medication works best with cognitive behavioral therapy, exercise, good sleep. So ask your clinician about strategies beyond medication. You also want to ask about follow-up visits. How will this work? What happens if the medication doesn't work or the medication causes so many symptoms that you can't take it anymore? How will you refill prescriptions? And you should know that since COVID, refilling prescriptions has become more and more difficult. Okay, so I mentioned that I'm going to talk about some low-cost help and support as well. Number 1, university clinics. If there's a university or nearby, check out their psychology or psychiatry departments. So the students at the psychology or psychiatry departments are supervised by professionals and they need real-world experience. So you can often get assessments and counseling at a fraction of the cost. Number 2, check to see if there are any local support groups. You can go on an app called Meetups, and oftentimes there are local support groups that are all about ADHD. Number 3, online ADHD support groups. So, online support groups like my free Facebook group, ADHD for Smartass Women. There are many others like that. Number 4, sliding scale therapy. Look for therapists who work on a sliding scale based on income. Number 5, online resources. There are so many free or low-cost online resources. Podcasts like this one, webinars. I do a free 3 days to fall in love with your ADHD brain. And of course, Attitude Magazine, Ada, Chad, they all have brilliant free resources. Number 6, try AI. There is an AI resource called Pi, P-I, and it's like having a therapist in your pocket. Well, sort of. So if you need to process something that's going on with you, you can literally talk into Pi and have it help you process something that is upsetting you. Pi comes up with strategies. It asks you questions. When I tried it, I literally started to laugh because I was processing something with Pi and then I got distracted. I put my phone down and a half an hour later, I picked up my phone and I saw that Pi had responded and I literally panicked because I felt like I had let Pi down and like Pi was a person. I really was impressed at how it helped me process something that I needed help processing at the time. And sometimes that literally is enough. You know, you just ask it for a strategy. Okay, when I am feeling overwhelmed, what are some things that I can try? What is a strategy that I can put together right now? Can you help me process that strategy? And it can be very helpful. Number 7, insurance coverage. If you have insurance, look at your policy. You might be surprised at what's covered, from therapy sessions to medication, and always ask providers about insurance acceptance. Sometimes they have options that you might not be aware of. Number 8, books. Books like mine, ADHD for Smartass Women. People forget that libraries have all the books on ADHD. Reading up on ADHD can provide insights and strategies at zero to low cost. If you're looking for a strength-focused book list to learn more about yourself and your brain, you can go to ADHDforsmartwomen.com/book list. Number 9, ADHD coaching. ADHD coaching is perceived as a premium service. Some coaches, however, offer group sessions or workshops at a lower price point. I always offer a few scholarship spots in my Your ADHD Brain is A-OK program every cohort that we run. Again, I really want to encourage you to educate yourself before you go in to see any clinician. It's not going to take much for you to know whether ADHD is something that explains most everything that you've ever questioned in your life. When we know it, we know it. Again, we need to learn how to trust our intuition. And so if you can do all of the preparation to support your intuition, you're going to go into that meeting with your clinician and you are going to be prepared, which means the outcome is likely going to be much better. So good luck to you. As I've mentioned, my brilliant friends, everything I talked about is in the show notes. You can find everything at ADHDforsmartwomen.com/podcast. As always, thank you for listening to the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast, and I will see you here, same time, same place next week. Until then, be brilliant. Bye for now. You've been listening to the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka. Join us at ADHDforsmartwomen.com, where you can find more information on my new book, ADHD for Smartass Women, and my patented Your ADHD Brain is A-OK system to help you get unstuck and fall in love with your brilliant brain.